Hello, everyone. It's Gregg Bendian here with the ProgCast. Another fascinating discussion with fascinating musicians. I wanted to start off today by just thanking everyone. A big thank you. The response for the first 10 or so episodes has really been overwhelming. And I'm just so thrilled by all your comments and your encouragement. And you know, we're trying to do something a little bit different here and get into some pretty arcane kinds of things, as well as some history for you all. And people have been telling me they're enjoying that. So knowing that people are enjoying what we're doing here means a lot. And thank you for subscribing, and thank you for liking what we're doing. There's a lot more to come. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank my producer and my editor, Matt Stober, who's really been key in making all this happen. Matt has been doing a great job in putting together these episodes for us and getting them out to everybody. So thank you, Matt. Well, I'm very excited because my guest today is a multifaceted individual, just a font of creativity, someone that I find very interesting, a composer, educator, poet, vocalist, double reed player. We have today with us, and I'm very happy to welcome Samuel Andreyev. Hi, Samuel.
Hi, Greg. Thank you so much for the invitation.
It's good to see you, and maybe we'll get into some different kinds of stuff today, because I know that you are quite an online presence with thousands of people following your analysis and enjoyment, sharing your viewpoints on the music of some pretty complicated composers and some pretty interesting and really uber creative, I like to say, the hard stuff. And you get in there and you I think create a real service for people, because there's always been a kind of lag between the audience for highly creative or unusual music, and there's always been a bit of an outreach problem between the audience and that music. And I don't know that it ever really needed to be that way, but someone like yourself comes along who's very enthusiastic, very verbal, and really wants to reach an audience and increase the audience for some pretty esoteric music. How important is that for you, and how gratifying has that been for you?
Well, it's very important to me. I'm very conscious of the fact that the things that I've been spending my life doing so far are really dependent on people's engagement and close listening and their attention in order to survive. It's for me, it's a very simple equation. It's just, if you don't have listeners and if you don't have people paying attention to the kind of music that I like, then it's not going to work. And I think that one thing that's really important in the world of composition, in a certain sense, is that especially today, perhaps more than any time in the last 150 years or so, it's crucial that composers not only create their work, but that they also understand how to create an audience for it. So you can't just create the work and expect that it will find its audience as a matter of course. That doesn't really happen. It was sort of possible for that to happen when we still had major publishing houses and major record labels supporting composers and this sort of thing, when there was a kind of infrastructure in place, let's say, so that sort of work could get out. Those things still exist more or less, but they're a lot less powerful now than they used to be. And the world of music is a lot more fragmentary. And so there's a lot of work, very, very good work being done, that just doesn't have any sort of major organ of distribution to get it out into the public eye. So I see it as being really one of the missions of a creative artist these days, whether it's a writer or a poet or a composer or whatever it might be, not just to do the work, but also to take care that the work is out there in the world. But it's not some sort of burdensome responsibility. This is actually a joyful thing. This is a really wonderful thing that allows you, thanks to the technology that we have today, to interact directly with people, right? Where you actually don't even really need those intermediaries as much anymore. I can put up a video of a piece of mine, or I can put it on some other platform, whatever it might be, and immediately, within minutes, in some cases, get some kind of resonance back from people who are listening to it and appreciating it and thinking about it. And they can be all over the world. I find this just absolutely phenomenal. I mean, I'm a member of that generation that didn't grow up with the internet, right? That we got internet when I was about 16, something like that. So I remember what it was like before the internet. So I'm still in this kind of, I can't believe this is actually real phase. Whereas I think that people that have grown up with it probably, they've only really ever known that. So it's maybe a little bit more normal to them, I don't know. But I'm intensely grateful for the opportunities that arise out of this technology, and the number of people that I've been able to reach through the YouTube channel, through all my different platforms that I use, has truly taken me by surprise. I never expected that would happen. I always hoped that my audience would continue to grow and develop, and that my work would find some kind of appreciation, let's say. But I wouldn't have been able to dream that something like this would happen. So that's where we are. I'm still amazed and dumbfounded that so many people are interested in what I'm doing. But that also gives me a great sense of purpose moving forward.
Yeah, and you're reaching, as I said, thousands of people. And as someone who's a bit older than you and came up with a much longer period of time without the interweb, and the ability to access stuff, it was all mom and pop shops. It was going to concerts. It was making cassettes of records you could find in the library. The number of cassettes I have here, it's completely insane. So, I remember the time when, if you wanted to know about Charles Wuorinen music, then you were going to try to find Charles Wuorinen or one of his students, as I did when I was in high school. I studied with Jeffrey Crespi, who was a Wuorinen student. But it was always like one or two people removed. So think about that. There's sort of the range of that, where you can go to that guy, if he's still alive, you can see one of his students, you can go to the library, but now you can find essays on the person, essays by the person, analyses, multiple versions of every piece. Obviously this is all very obvious, but the impact of that, you understand, means that there's kind of an accelerated, if people are using the internet, best case scenario, there can be an acceleration of learning and knowledge and using it as the tool that I use it for, which has been to continue to educate myself and continue to expose myself to things. So knowing that you were out there talking about Stockhausen, talking about Webern, talking about Beefheart, talking about Varese, talking about Fernihough, talking about all of what people would say are very tricky composers to deal with, and then trying to put a friendly face on that, if you will, and say to people, well, this is one way of looking at it. And as an educator myself, I do think that it's a big part of giving back the enthusiasm that you have for something that may not be one listening things. I particularly get off on things that I have to listen to several times and be rewarded with some type of, light bulb that's going to go off and say, oh, I can connect a couple of elements here in the first or second listening. It's not my it's my problem to deal with, to try to get to another level with this thing. So,
well, here's the thing. Here's the thing about difficult music, though. What I mean, difficult music being things that are hard to grasp, let's say, the first time or even the first 10 times for the average listener. I don't like to say the average listener because there's actually no such thing. Like, people are very different in their listening habits, but just use that for rhetorical simplicity. For any difficult composition, let's say, any difficult piece of music, there's a context in which that work is obvious and natural. But for the person that might be listening to it for the first time, they're not aware of that context. They don't know where it comes from. It's like an object that somehow ended up on Earth, but you know, that came from Mars, right? So part of what I'm trying to do is to just start with that. Whenever I do an analysis video, I always try to start by providing some context. In other words, where does this come from? What cultural moment does it come from? What country does it come from? What was happening in the other arts when this was happening? What was the composer thinking when they were writing it? What were they trying to express? All of these sorts of things. It's extremely important to provide context so that it doesn't just seem like this alien object that you can't connect to at all. So, and that's a huge problem because, you know, to take one example, the example of Stockhausen. So I did a video on a piece of his called Gesang der Jünglinge, which is an electronic piece that he made in the 1950s.
Great piece.
If you were involved in his circle, it's a great piece. If you were involved in his circle in Cologne or in Darmstadt or the other places where he was active in the 1950s, then what Stockhausen was up to would have been deeply impressive, but it wouldn't have been completely alien and impossible to understand. You would have understood about the development of electronic music. You would have understood about the language, the new language of serialism and music. You would have understood about the immediate post-war period and what that had done to the artists generally. Like, you would have had all of that, and nobody would have had to explain it to you. But for somebody growing up today who has, you know, maybe very little knowledge of things like that, who had certainly no direct experience of the post-war period in Germany, who doesn't know about electronic music, et cetera, then you're just going to hear that piece and just not know what on earth is going on. So, and I think that's true not just with difficult sort of post-war contemporary compositions. It's also true with classical music if you don't come out of that culture. I think it's the same thing. So, but what a lot of people listen to, and this is by no means a value judgment at all, but what a lot of people listen to is the music that is the most recent and that is the most common in their context, right? So that would tend to be pop music, commercial music, whatever the genre is. Those sorts of things don't require context for understanding because you're already immersed in that context, right? If there's a new song out by Justin Bieber or whoever, like, nobody has to explain to you what the lyrics mean. It's obvious. Maybe in 150 years, if you were to listen to that song, you would need the context because it would no longer be obvious. You wouldn't know what the figures of speech meant. You wouldn't necessarily understand the stylistic codes. Because obviously those things are constantly changing. So I like to think that if the listener is receptive and if the work is a good one, there's going to be some dimension to it that's going to transcend all of those questions. So you'll still appreciate the quality of the work and its power and its emotional force, even if you don't understand the history in the background. But my feeling is you can go a lot deeper and appreciate it more and love the piece more if you know a little bit more about it.
And maybe, you know, and you touched on this, but I think it's important to say, know about that person who wrote it and know what they were living and what the culture that they were responding to was. You know, Gesang der Jünglinge is 56, 57?
I'm not very good with dates. It's either 54 or 56. I can't remember.
So, you know, it's fascinating because then you have Varese at the same time premiering Des Airs in Paris. and I had contacted you recently because I found it fascinating that I'd never heard the recording of the premiere of Des Airs. And it's surprising to me how antagonistic and how negative the audience is responding to not even just the electronic music, but the ensemble music as well. Now, but the context on that is interesting because you talk about context. Des Airs is premiering on a program with, I think, Mozart and Verdi or something, something on a completely traditional program, and then you have Des Airs sat in the middle of this. So there's another level of context because the poor people sitting there who thought they had paid for a Mozart gig, then all of a sudden they're being hit with early tape experimentations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Des Airs is a really interesting example because it's the first, not just the premiere, but the first few performances were pretty disastrous, and a lot of people really didn't understand what he was up to in that piece. The other problem, though, is that it was premiered in France, and the French had a weird relationship with Varese. They didn't really like him very much. By that point, he'd been living in the United States for about 30 years, and they saw him as sort of French, but also sort of as a foreigner, and they just didn't know what to make of him. There was nothing in French musical life to compare to something like Des Airs at that time. So that's also part of it. Whereas Varese's great period was in the 1920s in New York, when he had a long string of premieres of pieces, each more spectacular and amazing than the last. And those pieces, things like Hyperprisme or Octandre or all of these Intégrales, all of these great Varese pieces, a lot of those pieces were actually very well received. And the American audiences that were attending the premieres of those things were, on the whole, curious and enthusiastic. And there are many very laudatory reviews, actually, of those pieces when they were first premiered. So once again, it's partly a question of context. In the 1920s in New York was a very different scene than Paris in the 1950s. Paris in the 1950s, you start to see the emergence of figures like Boulez and this new sort of musical vanguard. But the musical establishment at that time was very reactionary and conservative, much more than it would have been the case in New York in the 1920s. So, and that's probably still the case to some extent, even today.
Really?
Yeah, I would say so. French musical life, like in terms of what you might call contemporary composition, since the 1970s, I would argue, has been really viewed through the prism of philosophy and ideas and literature and ideologies. And that's been, in French musical life, that's sort of been the justification for the music a lot of the time. In other words, it doesn't always get appreciated on its autonomous terms as music, but as a statement of a particular type of aesthetic philosophy or something like that. And there's something very typically French about that. It's fundamentally a literary country in many respects. Music is not their native form of expression. So, which is not to say that there aren't, brilliant French musicians and composers, because obviously there are. But they seem to need to come to things through this sort of literary lens. And when that happens, it's very easy for things to settle into a narrow ideological framework of what music ought to do. And I don't find that in American musical life. I don't find a lot of composers, torturing themselves half to death with philosophical inquiries into the nature of music and what music ought to do. So that's one difference that I see.
How did you fare as an outsider in the French music scene?
Well, I arrived in France when I was 22 years old. And I'm now 39. So I've lived basically my entire adult life in France. And this is where I went to school and where my career has been, basically. So, but when I first arrived here, I was very excited and wide-eyed, of course, because I was seeing all of this for the first time. And basically just soaking it all up and very curious and going to all kinds of concerts and meeting lots of people. And one thing that was very exciting about Paris in the early 2000s was how international it was. So I met composers from all over the world. There were a lot of South Americans. There were Mexicans. There were some Americans. There were people from Japan, from Korea, really from all over the place. And that was also very exciting. And so in that sort of very international context, I felt actually relatively at ease, I would say. But at that point, when you're in your early 20s, you're a student, you don't really have a career yet. So I wasn't at that point yet confronted with the career issues of how do you make a living, and how do you find a publisher and get your work out there and have performances and all that sort of thing. All of that happened later. What I would say is that I never actually placed too much importance on the French scene per se. That was never my focus. That was where I was living. I like living in France. It's a wonderful country in many respects. It's a very nice place to live, and I have a lot of wonderful friends here and so on. But as far as the musical side of things goes, I was always interested in many countries, not just France, not just Canada where I'm from. So at the earliest opportunity, I remember taking trips to Germany, to Switzerland, to Italy, to the United Kingdom, to Scandinavian countries, to see what was going on in those places as well, and to attend concerts in all of these different countries. So my vision really was always all kinds of countries. It wasn't specifically France. And that meant that I was able to get a very broad view on what people were doing in a lot of different places, and not be too dependent on any particular local scene. So that was always my point of view. I don't seek to be a Canadian composer or a French composer or this or that composer. I'm not really interested in the labels, but just going where interesting things are happening, and connecting with people with whom I have some kind of a resonance, where there's a complicity. So I guess that's a long way of saying that I'm not dependent on the French scene, although I appreciate being part of it to the extent that I am part of it.
And in fact, you told me you're going to be starting a teaching position in Germany.
Yeah, well, my wife and I chose to live in Strasbourg in eastern France. And one of the things we really like about living here is that we live actually right on the border. So the German border is about 1 kilometer away from our house. And so I can get to Germany in a matter of minutes on my bike. But then Switzerland is also very close. We're about an hour from Basel. And then Paris is maybe an hour and 45 minutes away on the train. So we're very close to a lot of different places. And one of the nice things about living on a border, particularly the border of France and Germany, this is something that I find really interesting. It's hard to imagine two more different cultures than France and Germany. They're really very, very different from each other, not just linguistically, but in terms of the way people view the world, the way they think, the attitudes, all sorts of things. And we live right in the intersection of those two cultures. And so, I go to Germany almost every day, actually. And I do a lot of my writing in the German town that's just on the other side of the border. And every time I cross over, it doesn't matter how many hundreds of times I do it, it's still a shock. It's still like, wow, I'm in a different world, even though it's just 1 kilometer away. So that's a source of great stimulation, because it's not so much France or Germany, it's the weird intersection between those two things that I find really interesting about living here. So I decided that I'd better learn German, and I'd better, take some interest in what's happening on the other side of the Rhine. So I speak German now, and I started looking around for opportunities to teach in the region that's nearby, and so that's resulted in an expansion of my teaching activities. And so next week I'll be starting as a part-time lecturer in the town of Freiburg, which is just about an hour from Strasbourg.
And what will you be talking about with your students there?
Well, I'm teaching at the Hochschule für Musik, which is the music university. It's sort of like Germany has these high-level universities specifically for music, for composers and performers. And they have a music theory department, which has invited me to give a series of lectures on basically any topic I want pertaining to music theory. So what I chose to lecture on is the development of harmony in the 20th century, which is a topic that I'm very preoccupied with, actually, as a composer. It's totally fascinating for me just to see the process by which harmony evolved from being a relatively standardized thing, a relatively common vocabulary across Europe, actually, into something that was totally individual. By about the midpoint of the 20th century, you start to see composers coming up with totally idiosyncratic harmonic languages, like really unique, where composer X sounds nothing like composer Y, right? And that was a new phenomenon in the music world. So the process by which that happens, by which this sort of established language starts to fragment and dissipate and then turn into this ocean of different possibilities, is something that I'm really interested in.
That is fascinating, because sort of with the disillusion of goal-oriented harmony, you have this, well, okay, then it's wide open. How many notes are in a chord now?
Absolutely, yeah. It's extremely interesting, and the thing about it that is also very interesting, I find, is that despite the sort of gradual, what would you say, this sort of disappearance of, as you say, goal-oriented harmony. Pieces somehow still make sense. Like you might not have a common grammar anymore, but there's still something that holds them together and that causes them to be communicative and emotional and striking and all of those things that we ask for in a piece of music. So I'm interested in determining also, are there universal qualities to harmony where even though you might be working in this style or that style or using this type of chord or that type of chord or whatever, is there still some kind of universal dimension to harmony that no matter what way you're using it, there's still going to be certain basic principles that apply. Principles such as tension and resolution, principles such as directionality, which even if you don't have functionality, right, you don't have chords that relate to a particular scale, let's say, or to particular scale degrees, there might still be a sense of direction. You can still have some kind of idea of movement. So I'm interested in looking at the ways in which these sort of archetypal things that harmony does can still function even in a very idiosyncratic or personal or experimental language.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this topic, and particularly in what jazz guys ended up doing with harmony and chords and density of harmony. Guys like Alan Holdsworth come to mind. I'm wondering, so who will you be exposing the students to, or who's really up there for you in terms of the most kind of creative or wild use of an approach to harmony?
I'll probably start the course with Debussy. And Debussy is only partly a 20th century composer. Some of his most important works were in fact written in the 19th century. But I'll start with Debussy because I think one of the things that Debussy really achieved that is, quite phenomenally amazing is that he started to move away from functionality towards a conception of harmony that was based more on the timbre of the chord, like the particular quality of a chord that he's using. So it no longer matters quite as much what scale degree you're on or what the name of the chord is. What matters is I don't like this term because it's not very precise, but let's say the color of the chord.
Or the
its
weight.
particular quality. Or the weight, yeah, or the spacing, or the relative openness or closedness or dissonance or consonance or whatever we want to call it. The music becomes much less directional. It's more like, I often use the term, it's got a kind of like a dream logic to it, where it's very, very difficult to listen to a Debussy piece and then to sort of figure out afterwards what the architecture of it is. It's very, very hard to do that. It's sort of like jelly. It's like, what's the shape? I don't know what the shape of it is, you know? It's very odd. And yet when you're listening to it, you're constantly swept along. Like it takes you somewhere, but it's not clear how that process works exactly. Well, so I'll start with Debussy, because I think what he did was, yeah, go ahead.
Well, just sometimes it seems like voice leading gets him there. You know, it's like he hasn't abandoned that you know that he's going to go up a step, and then that's going to trigger a new event. And yes, he's dealing with a kind of block form to free himself from continuity concerns in a way. I find that fascinating about him, that he even presages ambient music in the way sometimes he'll get to a section and that it is just the texture of that section and that chord and pitches that are going to line up in a way that's going to even create sort of like a visual. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's an endlessly forward-looking composer, and you know, I could spend my lifetime studying his work. I mean, I've only started to barely scratch the surface. I'm by no means a Debussy expert, but I think he's a logical place to start if you're looking at the development of harmony in the 20th century. And Debussy's harmony actually had a lot of impact on jazz musicians also, which is another thing that's worth pointing out. You know, the famous Jess Stacy piano solo in the Carnegie Hall concert was influenced by Debussy, as were the solos by Bill Evans on Kind of Blue, right? So it crops up in jazz again and again, which is interesting. So I'll talk about Debussy. I'm going to talk about.
Well, I wanted to
this is something I always insisted.
Before we move off of Debussy, I think you'd appreciate this. When I interviewed Quincy Jones for the Oral History of American Music, I asked him what was it like to study in Paris in the 50s, because he was over there with Nadia Boulanger, and he was also studying, he had a weekly, I kind of like a meeting, Messiaen and 5 composers. I think it was Quincy, Philip Glass, and a couple of other people. And I said, so what did you do on these Wednesdays with Maestro? And he said, we listened to La Mer, and we analyzed how he got from section to section. And they would say,
yeah, well, yeah, I mean, you could spend,
you know, they'd say,
yeah, you could spend hours on that.
yeah, and he could have gone this way, he could have gone that way. Why did he go this way? And I also find one other thing about Debussy is the almost filmic way of dealing with form, so that a scene will come back later in a piece. I mean, you could talk about like the nocturnes, for instance, and it comes back later, but now it's altered, almost as if the lighting has changed on it, or he is shading it orchestrally differently.
Yep.
You know, and you see that's the reason that he becomes so important to film noir composers and film composers that are working in the 20s, 30s, 40s, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no end to it. The piece that I will start with is the Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, which is completely fascinating in terms of how that piece is put together, where you have this totally ambiguous theme that doesn't belong to any particular key that keeps getting harmonized in different ways. So it's like, it's almost cubistic in a way. Like you keep seeing this totally ambiguous object in a new light and hearing it differently each time. So that's a piece I'm very fond of. But I'm also going to talk a lot about American music. And this is something that I like to do, actually. I also teach here in Strasbourg. And I'm struck by the fact that in France, and also in Germany to some extent, there's an entire, let's say, there are multiple generations of really super significant American composers that just aren't really all that well known in Europe. And that should be. And among them, first and foremost for me is Carl Ruggles, who is a totally amazing character and wrote just phenomenal music. I love Carl Ruggles. And the thing about Ruggles, for those listeners who may not be familiar with his work, that I find so interesting is that he was working in a direction that is weirdly similar to some of what was happening in Europe at the same time in the 1920s and 1930s, but totally without being interested in what those things were, and developing his own totally idiosyncratic techniques to arrive at a somewhat similar place. So I love the independence of it, this sort of idea that you would just sort of roll up your sleeves and say, okay, let's just find some new way of approaching this issue, this problem. How do I write totally chromatic harmony and have this constant turnover of pitches, but still make it really cohesive and strong and striking, and have a really intense emotional force to the music.
Well, it's like you look at Ruggles' Sun Treader, and it's a series of variations. And it's not like there's 20 ideas in Sun Treader. It's kind of like 3 themes, isn't it?
Yeah, there's like 1 or 2 ideas in that piece. Yeah.
So a good person to get in on, and if you're interested in checking out Ruggles, check out Sun Treader. But I think it also makes sense. Plus, it's not cool. It's hot music.
Oh yeah.
It's sort of like it has a level of intensity that would probably surprise people at that moment, and it kind of still does.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things about Ruggles that I find so captivating is that it's music that hasn't lost any of its power to shock and surprise. And you know, we often use the term new music to describe contemporary composition, but for me, a lot of new music isn't really new music. What new music is for me is a piece that, no matter if it was written yesterday or 100 years ago, when you listen to it, it sounds fresh and new every time. And you never get tired of it, right? And it's telling you something urgent about the world that nobody else is telling you. That's what new music is. That's what the Rite of Spring does. It's like, maybe you've heard the Rite of Spring 50 times. When you hear it, it still has something shocking and unsettling about it. It's the same with Ruggles.
And
So I'm
Amerique.
going to talk about him. Absolutely. I mean, and I'm going to talk about Ruth Crawford Seeger, who is a hugely important figure that just you don't hear about very much. You know, Ruth Crawford Seeger is a composer I really love. She had to cut her career short for various reasons. Well, partly due to motherhood and partly due to the fact that she earned her living increasingly as a piano teacher. But so the bulk of her music was written by the time she was in her 30s, early 30s, which is in itself a kind of an interesting fact. But so Ruth Crawford Seeger was the stepmother of Pete Seeger, which is also really quite interesting. And she was the wife of Charles Seeger, who's a very important American theorist. He wasn't much of a composer, but he was a very important theorist. And here's the other thing, she was hugely important in reviving interest in American folk music at a time when nobody was interested in that. Right. So Ruth Crawford Seeger, not only was she this, brilliant avant-garde composer, writing work that is, I think, absolutely at the summit of what was being done in America at the time. But in addition to that, she sort of launches this whole folk music revival, and starts publishing anthologies where she very carefully transcribes these folk songs and goes around collecting them. And that led directly to things like Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie and all of these other people. So she really had her feet in both camps. Like, she's interested in this sort of vernacular, traditional, popular folk expression, and also in this hyper-modern sort of music that was being developed on both sides of the Atlantic.
And of course, this is
so a totally fascinating figure.
But of course, fascinating too in the lens of someone like Charles Ives.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Ives is a little bit harder to talk about with respect to harmony, partly because his music has so many facets to it, which, to my ears anyway, are only tangentially harmonic. One of the things that you get a lot of in Ives is this sort of layering of different, often unrelated or even antinomic materials in a piece. Like the Fourth Symphony is probably the most extreme example of that, where you just have layer after layer after layer of music going on in different tempi and in different keys, all going on at the same time. And I'm not sure that the effect is primarily a harmonic one, really. It's something else. So I guess in pieces like the Concord Sonata, you can talk about harmony. But in the music that I associate most with Ives, or at least the pieces that strike me the most from him, it's not so much a harmonic thing that I get from it.
Is it collage?
But I'm not sure it's collage either. It's something else. I don't know what it is exactly. It's I think that the different strands in a piece by Charles Ives are a little bit more organically connected than would be the case in a collage where you just take unrelated things, because he had a sense of dramatic continuity. He had a sense of when do you need things to change, or when do you need things to speed up, or when do you need things to stop. That was perfect. He had a perfect sense of timing. And the materials are very, very carefully balanced in his pieces, I find. But anyway, I don't know exactly how to describe it. I don't really have the technical vocabulary on the tip of my fingers to describe how Charles Ives's music works. Maybe I need to think about it a little bit more. But the way it works for me, anyway, is it's like a gut sensation. It's something that hits you over the head. It's like, it's so powerful and it's so exciting to listen to, and I'm reduced to using words like that to describe it.
I've spent a lot of time with his music. They have his scores up at Yale. The handwritten stuff, the stuff that's falling apart. They also have the Ruggles scores there too, by the way, where he uses colored pencils. And I found that interesting. He had color ideas for certain musical ideas. But you're talking about you're talking to an American composer, but someone who grew up, aware of Cowell and aware of Wallingford Rieger, to the extent that they were very inspiring figures. I'm so glad to hear that you find them exciting and inspiring, because it's the rugged individualist American musician thing. And I always feel like that.
Well, there's an anecdote I'll tell you, which is that when I was a teenager, I had a friend who was a bookseller who said, I've got a book that you'll be really interested in, because he knew I was interested in music and composition and all of that. It turned out to be Bad Boy of Music by George Antheil. And so he lent me a copy of that book, and I took it home and was totally fascinated. I devoured it. I read it really quickly and read it actually several times. That book made a huge impression on me. I later found out that at least half of it is fiction, but that didn't matter. Antheil was a figure that I wanted to know more about, because his work seemed to have a feeling of just sheer excitement and joy and discovery, and just sort of this sort of intense excitement he had at transgressing boundaries and going farther than anybody else had gone, and sort of creating these really quite insane pieces like the Ballet Mécanique. So, but at the time, you know, there was actually very little easily accessible information on Antheil, right? This was really in the early days of the internet. There wasn't much available. And I desperately wanted to know more. I wanted to see the score of the Ballet Mécanique and of his piano sonatas and violin sonatas and all of these things. And you couldn't get them. Now they're published by Schirmer's and you can buy them, but at that time it wasn't yet the case. So I can't remember how I found this out, but I ended up writing to Charles Amerkanian. He said, well, you got to contact this guy called George Boswick, who is in charge of the Antheil materials at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. So I was living in Toronto at the time. I took the bus up to New York City, went to the New York Public Library, and spent days and days combing through the Antheil archives. And that was how I found out about Antheil. It's like, that really is a very different sort of experience than just sort of clicking on a web page and downloading a PDF, or, you know.
It means a lot.
It means a lot because there's something personal about it. You're on the phone with people like Charles Amerkanian, which it was he who granted me the special permission to go and access these materials. And then you're going on a trip. You're going to New York City, and you're actually looking at the physical materials that Antheil created, his actual manuscripts, and that was so exciting, you know, to get to do all of that stuff. And it gave me a sense of immediacy, immediate contact with the work that I don't think I would have had otherwise. So anyway, so I'm very attracted to figures like that, you know, who are adventurers, who are explorers, who are excited and just, you know, always seeking to go farther somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the people. And Seeger is interesting. You know, I'm glad you mentioned her as well. I was in Germany, I want to say like 10 years ago, on tour playing I don't know what tour it was. It might have been one of my things. But there was an ensemble in, I'm trying to remember where, that did a complete Ives program, like everything that was available. And that impressed me because I saw, and then I spoke to some people. I said, yeah, Ives is being appreciated more now in Europe.
Yeah, I hope that's the case, because it really wasn't the case for a long time.
Dusseldorf.
I don't know exactly. Dusseldorf, yeah. I don't know why that is. I really don't. But still, the composers of that generation, you mentioned Wallingford Rieger and others. I mean, I've been living in France for almost 20 years. I've never heard anybody speak of Wallingford Rieger, not once. So, and that's a shame, you know. But I suppose that's true of any country. Like every country has its figures that are known nationally or locally, but that don't necessarily get exported all that much. I could reel off, you know, dozens of names of French composers that nobody in North America would have heard of. It's the same everywhere. And then there's the figures that for one reason or another do get exported, and it's interesting. It's not always obvious exactly why that is. And why is it that everybody's heard of Steve Reich, for example? Everybody in France knows who Steve Reich is, you know.
Well, I wanted to ask you about a Canadian composer who wound up in France. Do you know this composer's music, Claude Vivier?
Oh, yes, yeah.
So were you aware of him when you were in Canada?
Yeah, sure, yeah, because you have to remember, in Canada, we don't have a large number of musical heroes, let's say. People that are creative artists who have created a body of work that is really distinct and original and all of those sorts of things. The history of composition in Canada is is actually shorter than that of the United States, right? Because we didn't really start to have major creators, I would say, until maybe the 1950s. People like John Weinsweg, John Beckwith, Violet Archer, there's a few others. And even those names probably are mainly only known in Canada. So it's not that long of a list of names, really. But high up on that list are two names, which are Claude Viviere, who's from Quebec, and Armory Schaefer. So you couldn't really be a composer of any kind in Canada and not know who those two people are. The other thing about Vivier is that he has this sort of really quite tragic life story and just a very unusual personal biography. And that's something that attracts attention. So even if you haven't heard a note of his music, if you just look at the basic facts of his biography, it's immediately striking. You become curious. You're like, well, what sort of music does a person like this write?
And it was fascinating that he was connected to Stockhausen.
That's right. Yeah, he studied in Cologne with Stockhausen and lived in Europe actually for a fairly significant portion of his life, in Germany and also in France. So he's one of the two Canadian composers, along with Schaefer, that from the past 70 years or so, let's say, that has a very high status abroad and that gets regularly performed outside of the country.
Was he inspiring to you?
Probably not in my student days when I was still living in Canada, because I was interested in other things at that time. I actually didn't start to listen seriously and closely to his music until quite a bit later. I don't know why that is exactly. I mean, I did listen to lots of Canadian music, but yeah, it didn't particularly affect me, I would say, as an artist. Yeah, what I was really interested, I mean, it's odd. I was interested in two things. I was interested in very old music, and then in post-war music, post-war European music. Those were sort of my two main centers of interest, I would say. There were lots of other things as well. I mean, as you know, I listened to all kinds of pop music and avant-garde rock music and stuff like that. But as far as composition goes, those were my two sort of main interests, I suppose. So I just naturally gravitated towards those things.
So who were your main guys then as composers coming up?
Well, when I was 18 or 19, it was certainly Stockhausen, Boulez, Luciano Berio, Luigi Nono, Webern, Schoenberg, Berg, Bartók, Debussy, Stravinsky, those sorts of names. Those were all very, very big for me. And then in parallel to that, I was obsessed with Bach, completely obsessed, and fascinated by the depth of his music, and also by the sort of the weird directions that his technical explorations led him in, particularly in later works like the musical offering, The Art of Fugue, and things like that. So I suppose I was naturally drawn towards music that had that kind of depth to it, something that you could spend years studying, that, like a kind of almost fathomless complexity and richness. That was something that I looked for, but at the same time with a level of, let's say, immediate seduction that was there too, where you could hear it once and be thrilled and excited. But the more you would look at it, the more you would peer into the abyss of the piece, let's say, the more you would get drawn into its intricacies and its mystery and all the different things that it was with Stockhausen. So it's the same thing as what I described with Antile. I read in a book by Paul Griffiths, who's a great writer on music, about this piece Gruppen, where you had multiple orchestras and they were playing at different speeds, and you had to have different conductors, to coordinate the whole thing. totally fascinated by this. I was like, what could a piece like that possibly sound like? So, you know, so I went to HMV to buy the CD. They didn't have it. You know, it was an expensive import. I had to order it, wait for a month for it to come in. I tried to find a copy of the score. Nobody had it. I had to buy the score. It cost a fortune, you know. And I actually had to save up for weeks to be able to buy that thing. You know, a piece like Gruppen was like several months of effort. Like just acquiring the materials, reading them, trying to study it, trying to understand how it was put together. And so that made a big impression on me. And then also Boulez, certainly, especially the piano sonatas, which I think were probably the first things I heard of Boulez.
The thing that fascinates me about Stockhausen is viewing him as a post-Wagner composer.
Yeah, there's something about the grandiosity of his vision and the way that he pulls in all of these different threads into his work, especially the Licht project, which is where for the past 35 or so years of his life, he was writing this gigantic 7-day-long opera, one opera for every day of the week. And he wrote the texts himself, and he designed the costumes. He did practically everything. He made the electronic sounds. He wrote the scores, obviously. It was this idea of the total artwork, which is very Wagnerian conception. Some people have criticized him for being a kind of megalomaniac and for trying to do everything and for sort of exceeding the limits of his own abilities in a certain sense. Boulez was very critical of the literary dimension of those operas, which he found to be much less convincing than the musical aspect. And a lot of people thought that Stockhausen had just completely gone crazy with this weird, esoteric, cult-like religious stuff he was getting into. But whatever. I mean, I've heard Donnerstag aus Licht, which is the Thursday part of the cycle. I've heard that twice live, and it's a great work. It's just a great work. I really, really enjoy it. So, but the thing about, you know, many of the artists that we've been talking about, so Antheil, Stockhausen, Charles Ives, and so on, is the grandiosity of vision. It's like how far they were willing to take their vision.
Ives had the Universe Symphony.
You know, unwilling. Exactly. Yeah. So you can't get any more grandiose than that. But it's like, how far can you push it? What can you get away with? It's like, and then what happens when you do that? And what happens when you persist with it and you make sure that those insane visions actually are realized and get performed and recorded and get out there in the world, and then they gradually become repertoire pieces. That's a really, like, these aren't people that are just sort of satisfied with the status quo. And it's like, okay, the things that we already know how to do, the things that people already know they enjoy. It's like, here's something that's completely from out of left field. It's going to completely change the way that you view music. I'm going to invent all of these new approaches and techniques in order to make it happen. And just the visionary quality is something that is really appealing.
Well, it's like visionary, futurist, modernist, all about forward, but having dealt with tradition, having gone through the rigors of an education, but also just acculturating yourself, and then you have an idea. And it's fascinating to me that, the extreme levels that jazz guys went to. I was just talking with Dave Liebman about this, about the later period Coltrane, which I found very interesting, but a lot of people thought Coltrane lost his mind at the end. So it's a tricky situation because within its time, very often forward-looking things are just not going to register. But when you look at, I say it's the 50-year rule. I like to use 50. But, give somebody 50 years on a piece and, it's going to sound totally different in this context.
That's true. Yeah. I think that's generally true. There are some things that even after 50 years, people still find very challenging and difficult.
Like what?
So, well, a lot of people really struggle with Webern, for example. They find Webern very difficult to listen to, just a very sort of alien and unapproachable sound world, I think, for a lot of people. That's an example. John Cage is a major stumbling block for a lot of people. They, you know, they really struggle with it. Like you might find the personality appealing and the ideas appealing, but when it actually comes to sitting down and listening to the pieces, you know, they're not willing to do that. And a lot of the really important Cage pieces are now 50, 60 years old or more, right? So we've had some time to get used to them, but people still struggle with them.
Are you referring to more of the conceptual pieces or the notated pieces? Because I found that like Amores and the percussion constructions, and then also the prepared piano pieces are a good place to get people in for Cage.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Those pieces, I think, are relatively approachable. And actually, there's another major piece that doesn't get the attention it deserves, which is the Concerto for Prepared Piano, which I think is a masterpiece. That's a great, great score. It doesn't get mentioned very often, which I don't really understand. It's full of gorgeous timbres. It's so beautiful, that piece. And it's immediately appealing also.
Yeah, that's a great one to mention. It's got it all in a way. Plus, I often view that as a post-Debussy piece because he's doing that same thing of setting up areas and changing, and it's like jump cuts, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of the really difficult things, I'm referring more to things like the Concert for Piano and Orchestra, or the Freeman Etudes. Things like that, which are I heard a performance in Darmstadt of the complete Freeman Etudes by Irvine Arditi. And even at Darmstadt, which is where people go to listen to difficult things, even at Darmstadt, they weren't really that into it, you know, which is kind of interesting to me.
I always had trouble with Cage. In fact, we did a Cage festival at Rutgers when I was a student there, and Mr. Cage came, and I don't know that he rehearsed us, but I think he listened to a rehearsal. And then when the famous 433 was performed by a pianist, I think he was really upset that the audience made noises. And I found that fascinating because you have two things going on there. One is that, well, the audience definitely responded to the situation, right? They weren't necessarily in on it. You know, you can't always explain to an audience, but at the same time, you know, what takes place in a vacuum? And if that piece isn't a vacuum, I don't know what it is. But here's the fascinating part, Samuel. Mr. Cage was really unhappy with that performance. And
yeah, I think one of the interesting tensions in Cage's work, and it's kind of a hard thing to wrap your mind around in a way, is that you look at some of these pieces and they're written using either very conceptual or graphic notations, and you look at them and it's like, well, you know, it's like an invitation to do whatever you want in a certain sense. Because if you look carefully at the instructions and you try to understand the notation, and then you realize, you know, some kind of authentic version of the piece, and then you compare that to what somebody else did who was also trying to make an authentic version of the piece, often you'll be faced with two things that sound very different. And so, like, is that in fact a piece? Is that in fact a composition? When you can have 5 different realizations of the score that all sound actually quite different from each other. But at the same time, it really wasn't an invitation to do whatever you want, right? There's a discipline to it. There's an importance to process and to taking the thing seriously that was incredibly important to him. And he would get very upset if he felt that performers weren't taking it seriously, or they were just using it as an excuse to make stupid jokes or whatever, which happened to him all the time. And you have to figure that, especially in his early days, when he was having pieces played in New York City, by performers that thought he was a total clown and were making fun of him, that must have left a mark on him. You know, that was probably very painful and hurtful to have to go through that period. So,
but it was interesting because we would see him everywhere. He went to concerts. So he would go to Roulette, he would go to Experimental Intermedia, he'd be sitting a few seats away from you at an improv concert. So he didn't have a problem with improvisation. So that's fascinating too, because I know when I was playing with Derek Bailey at Roulette, he came to listen and thought it was cool. So I think my question became to him, which wasn't really something we ever got into. I did have an argument with Boulez about improvisation, but I won't get into that. But with Mr. Cage, I guess what I felt was, what is it that you've set in motion with your notation system here that is going to absolutely communicate limits to the performer to avoid these discrepancies in interpretation, right? So you've basically set up a football field, but you have a very specific idea, where the markings are, but you're not telling anybody. Was a bit of what I felt about it with Cage. And I wonder, how you feel about that.
Well, I find some of the works more intriguing than others. And there are some, this is part of the conceptual thing also, which is that sometimes in conceptual art, whether it's music or literature or painting or whatever it might be, in a certain sense, the idea, the concept is the thing, and the physical realization of it, or the particular version of it that you're interacting with in the real world, is of less importance. So in that sense, some of the pieces are interesting to think about, right? In terms of their potential, in terms of what might happen if you were to do this. When you actually sit down and listen to them, it might be less exciting. And that's how I feel about some of those pieces. Things like Fontana Mix, for example, or the Imaginary Landscape piece for 12 radios and things like that. It's like, fantastic idea, but I don't want to sit and listen to it for 20 minutes. I just don't, there are things that I'd rather listen to.
So in that way, he's much more of a fluxist, or he's much more of a Dadaist than he ends up being a post-Germanic composer, or certainly with his interest in the East, you have this kind of breaking down of the ego. He's trying to subvert the ego and the will in so many of those verbal scores, chance operation scores, this sort of thing. But I always felt like the question was, okay, well, then what is it if it isn't this, right?
That's a good point. And that's actually the rejoinder that you can give to people who say this isn't art, or this isn't music, or this isn't that or that. You say, okay, well, if it isn't that, then what is it? And it's like, well, I suppose you would have to say that it is music, but it's music that might not have the same concept of the work of the piece, right? It might be something much more fluid. It might be something that has to be recreated every time. I suppose that from my own perspective as an artist, to view things in that way is to delegate a very important part of the creation of the work to the performer. And for me as a composer, in my own practice, I can't do that. Or at least I'm not willing to do that. Which is not to say that interpretation is not very important. And I have many wonderful performers that I work with on a regular basis whose judgment I respect very much, and who will bring something to my pieces that I couldn't have imagined. But I can't conceive of producing a work in that manner where you're delegating that many important decisions to the performer. So, but that's just a different approach, I suppose, than Cage's.
Well, I always say that, it's how much freedom do you want in a piece? And I played the graphic pieces of Earl Brown and Christian Wolff, and, you know, always with what we call, when we were coming up with this stuff, by the way, performance practice was goodwill. So the idea was you go into it and you're not jerking around and you're not trying to make a joke of it. It's amazing that that was taught, by the way, because you weren't intuiting that from the score. Now that could be a limit of the performer, but it's fascinating to me that I had to have my Juilliard trained teacher in high school say to me, yeah, but what happens if somebody decides to play Mary Had a Little Lamb?
Right.
So you're already having that discussion, you know? So look,
yeah. Well,
I was into conceptual art as the next person, you know, or maybe more than some. But I think that what becomes the amount of freedom that you give is something that you take responsibility for as a composer.
Well, it also it sort of looks like freedom, but it isn't actually freedom. I read a really interesting book about Morton Feldman's graph pieces that was put out a few years ago, and that's a really fascinating topic because, you know, Feldman wrote these pieces where the score consists of a series of boxes, right, in which you would have different categories. You could have a high box, a low box, or a medium box, and that would sort of tell you what general register to play in. And it would tell you, if it's a string instrument, it would say this is arco, this is pizzicato, and so on. It would tell you the dynamic, and it would tell you, you know, how many sounds to play in a given ictus in a certain amount of time. So you look at those and you say, well, okay, you could follow the instructions to the letter and play something in a, you know, in C major, right? But nobody does that when they play those Feldman graph pieces. They never do that. It always sounds sort of like Feldman. It's this sort of chromatic music with a lot of dissonant intervals and so on, and it's sort of vaguely Weberian in sound. And it's not written in the score that, you know, you should use these types of intervals, but it's something that is just stylistically appropriate in terms of the sort of music that he was interested in and what he was interested in doing. And Feldman used to get really upset at performers who would take pieces like that and play things that he thought were not stylistically in line with what he wanted. And it's very interesting because he never put that in the score. He never said, these are the sorts of sounds I want. So it's freedom of a sort, but it's not really freedom because you still have to do something that is appropriate with respect to what the composer was trying to do and what their particular world is that they were in. And you have to understand what those things are and do them sensitively. And so some things are delegated. It's like the precise choice of pitches is ultimately left up to the performer, but you still do have to enter into that world. So it's true. Nothing says that you can't play Mary Had a Little Lamb, but it wouldn't, you know, it still wouldn't be right to do that. So there's a lot of unwritten things in these scores, right? Even though it's not explicitly stated, there's still, you know, there's still things that are stylistically appropriate. Just as is the case, I would argue, with things like with Corelli or other early Baroque composers, where often the score is a skeleton, right? You have either a figured bass or plus maybe a very skeletal melodic line, and then the performers have to flesh that out. They have to fill out the accompaniment and embellish the melody and all of that sort of thing. And there are stylistic conventions around the ways that you would do those things. So I think it's the same to some extent with Feldman and Cage.
Did you think that Stockhausen's Icluse was sort of related in this discussion?
That's a piece that actually gives quite a lot less freedom to the performer. So even though the notation is unconventional and many aspects of the score are unusual, nevertheless, for the most part, it's relatively traditional, I would say, in terms of the relationship between the performer and the score itself. But it's a great piece, certainly.
What did you start working with as a young creator? Was it words or musical notes?
It was comics, actually. When I was a child, I was really enthusiastic about comic strips and comic books, And so I started out actually as a visual artist and doing paintings and drawings and making comics. And something about the language of comics, I suppose, was very appealing to me because you could put a lot in a very small space. And you could have these very simple, iconic visual vocabularies and yet still communicate really quite subtle things. So, and then I also like just the reduced format also, you know, the instant delivery of the message or the gag or whatever it would be. You know, it would take 4 seconds to read. So I was actually quite preoccupied with that for years. At one point, I actually thought I would be a cartoonist, believe it or not. But all of these things happen in parallel to each other. So at the same time, I was playing the cello. I started playing cello when I was maybe 10 years old, and I was studying composition early as well, learning music theory, and sort of trying to teach myself to play piano. Also, I never took any piano lessons, but just trying to figure it out on my own. And then when I was about 14, I started writing songs. I was really, you know, I loved listening to rock music and particularly of a more adventurous sort. You know, things that would really, you know, expose you to a really exotic and new world. Those were the sorts of things that I found stimulating. And I just desperately wanted to write songs. So I just started doing it. I didn't know how to write songs. I could barely play the piano, or, you know, I had very, very rudimentary skills, but I had this intense desire to make these things. So I wrote hundreds of songs and recorded them in the garage of my parents' house. I spent years doing that, hours and hours a day, thousands of hours of work altogether. I recorded 7 or 8 albums. I don't remember anymore exactly how many of these songs. And most of them probably aren't that good, but it was a great learning experience. I had to learn how to play instruments. I had to learn how to mix. You know, I got all of these books on, you know, mixing for home musicians and things like that. Just, you know, learn the basic technical aspects of how do you record and mix, how do you mic instruments, that kind of thing. So that was between I was 14 and 20, I guess, was when I did the bulk of that stuff. And I learned a lot in that process. It actually taught me a lot about composition, even though it wasn't really composition that I was aiming for at that time.
You recently reissued one of these song albums from 20 years ago.
Yes, I did. Yeah. That's called Swallows, and that's an album that I recorded in 1999 when I was 18. Yeah. And Swallows is a thing, actually. It's funny to be talking about it because it was put out on a CD in 2000. And I did actually quite a lot of concerts in Toronto at that time to promote it. And I had an ensemble. But then after I moved to Europe, I go too much beyond that. And nobody here really has heard it. And it wasn't on the internet at all until just a few weeks ago, actually. So it's been interesting to take, an artifact like that from my ancient past and have it be out in the world again. And re-listening to it, I'm struck actually by the fact that there's a lot of things in it that are kind of similar to what I'm doing now. In a very primordial and much more, I suppose, untutored way on that album. But I can still, I recognize myself in it. I know what I was up to, and it's me. It's still me, even though I was very young.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about it is that since the lyrics are written by someone who's a very serious poet and a serious wordsmith, that you're bringing to songs some pretty abstract poetry, some pretty abstract word construction, which I couldn't say enough about that, because for me, the frontier in songwriting in many ways is the word. And particularly if you look at how much bad lyric writing there is in songs, that someone who puts as much thought and effort into it as you do, to me, that's very impressive because, you know, I had this very strange experience of talking to an author, Michael Chabon, who's a well-known, like, Pulitzer Prize-winning author in America, and saying to him, so you're into progressive rock and Yes and these kinds of things. So what do you think of Yes lyrics? And he said to me, well, they're just oral matter to me. They're, you know, and that fascinated me, that someone who is a writer, who would care so much about the word, hears it being really well done, I think, in Yes, something like Gates of Delirium, and just says, oh, well, it's just sounds. Whereas in your case, you know, clearly every word, every sound of word, every syllable, the rhythm of the words, the word choice, all of this stuff is so high level to me. And I don't know if there's a question there, if that's just a compliment, but it is something that I noticed right away about your songwriting.
Well, thank you. I put a lot of care into the words. When I was writing lyrics, was, first of all, that there were two things that fundamentally didn't really interest me much in song lyrics. The first was narrative. So I'm not interested in telling a story, really. And the second one was sentiment. So I'm not interested in, let's say, exploring a particular subjective emotional world that relates to my personal feelings. Which isn't to say that the songs are not emotional. It just means that they're not using this sort of language, this sort of codified language of sentiment that you get in a lot of pop music, where it's using very familiar language that you've already heard 1,000 times in 1,000 other songs. So those were the two things that I wasn't really interested in. So when you take away sentiment and narrative, what's left? So what's left, I think, is sensation, first of all, the sensation of the words sort of pouring over you, so to speak. Assonance, assonance and the sound of them, the way they scan, the way the syllables sound, and also a particular type of vocabulary. Why do you use this word instead of this word? What does this word mean? What does this word make people think of? And these sorts of associations that words have, and then constructing a little world out of these words that I would choose that would relate together in a way that I would find stimulating. But yeah, in a sense, the words were designed to sound good on a recording. And I think that the best rock lyrics, that's what they do. You know, like, I think if you listen to a rock song for the narrative, there's something, it doesn't make sense to me. It really doesn't. It's like, well, read a novel if you want a narrative, or watch a movie. Right? A pop song is 2 or 3 minutes long for the most part. You don't have time to get in a narrative. You can tell a little story, I guess, but it's not the thing I find the most interesting. So they don't do that. But I mean, if you look at, you know, Frank Zappa would always say, look at doo-wop lyrics. It's like they're nonsense. They literally don't mean anything. They're invented syllables. But they sound great, right? They sound really fantastic. And a lot of lyrics are like that. It's like they're there for their phonic qualities and for the particular way that the singer can manipulate these sounds in an exciting way. And the question of narrative, of the sentiment, or even in some cases the meaning, is really secondary. So they're a vehicle for the singer. So that's what I was trying to do. And I'm not a great singer. I'm not even a good singer, really. But there were certain things that I could do with my voice, and certain things that I wanted to do with it, and a certain type of, let's say, expression that I wanted to get at. And a lot of that type of expression had to do with the feeling that there's too much coming at you. You can't keep up with it. The words are coming fast. They're complicated. You can't keep up. So you don't have enough time really to form an image out of them and sort of string it together into something resembling a coherent story. It's too fast, and there's too many words. So you just have to kind of listen, I guess, in a different way. If you want to, you can listen multiple times and you can look at the words closely, and there are definitely focal points to each of the lyrics. There are things that they're saying. There are things that there are themes that are being explored. But that might, I realize that might not be evident the first time you hear it.
But it's participatory too, because if you're not coming out and just saying, "Hey, baby, I love you," or whatever the topic might be of a song, you're inviting the audience to kind of take on their own journey through the imagery that you're presenting, right? You're not picking words out of a hat, right? You're not having a computer generate words randomly. And yet they might seem to have, well, we could say lack context, but also, not a clear message on first listening. But I love the experience of then letting images fire in my mind, and abstract lyrics and poetry. I mean, I was always fascinated by Syringa, the Carter piece with the John Ashbery poem in it. I mean, what the hell is he talking about? But the way Carter uses the words and the scansions of the sounds and the imagery of Ashbery is intense. And I guess what I really wanted to say about your stuff is that you seem to also be very interested in a kind of a condensation, or even like you talked about a lot of rapid fire stuff, but even just the idea that it's kind of succinct. And I wondered if the comic strip and the word bubble didn't somehow, filter into this, because, I'm also a very visual person, someone who grew up with comic books. And I know that those panels influence the way that I organize my music. Not always.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you need a 2-page spread and you have one big idea. But the idea of division of events and arrival points and transition from box to box, because kind of in a way our ideas are boxed to box to box. How do we defeat that? Transitions, dovetailing things. So yeah, I guess that's another compliment really, is that your stuff is very to the point and in a way focused, where it's not really a litany of ideas. I mean, certainly there's a lot of rapid fire word stuff going on at times, but I feel like you try to be very clear and in a way simple.
Yeah, I do. I try to be as clear as I possibly can be, given what it is that I have to say. I don't like excessive or arbitrary complexity. So if something is complex in something that I've done, it has to be because there's something complex about the idea, and you can't get it across any other way without destroying it. That would be kind of a genuine or authentic complexity, and that's what I'm interested in. But complexity isn't even the point. It's not. I'm not interested in complexity. I'm interested in richness and depth, and those are things that are very important to me. If I get bored if I'm listening to something and I get the idea in 10 seconds, it's like, I understand what's going on. I can probably extrapolate to what's going to happen 10 minutes later. It's like, why bother even listening? It's like, it's something that just sort of is playing on memories of things you've already heard, but slightly varying them with a slight edge of novelty so that you don't get completely bored. It doesn't do it for me. It has to be really engaging on every level. So that's what I try to do. And I try to make things that have what I would consider to be sufficient depth, and that would be exciting to listen to for the ideal listener that I have in mind.
Yeah, I didn't know that aspect of your musicality. It was very fascinating to hear the song composer, and then to really get more into your chamber music and your more orchestral stuff. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about iridescent notation. There's so much on there and so many different musical areas, working with words, with vocal, but also just all the various color choices that you make. I find your stuff to really be beautiful coloristically speaking. And I always like to hear people that are trying to, make a vivid statement in their work.
Yeah, well, thank you. Color is incredibly important to me. It's something that I grasped intuitively, actually, before I became a composer. Just listening to pop and rock music, it's so obvious that a big part of what makes that music exciting is that you have artists that are coming up with a new sound, a distinctive sound, right? It can be, the invention of the fuzz bass, for example, something like that, or it can be, using a particular type of guitar a particular way, or the way that they would mic Ringo Starr, where they would put tea towels over the drum heads and use this heavy compression and all of that kind of thing to give it that really distinctive sound. Those are not decorative secondary aspects to pop songs.
They're compositional.
They're really important. They're compositional. Yeah. They're intrinsic to the piece itself. And when you grow up listening to those sorts of things and getting really into the physical material of sound and the impact that has and the different ways that you can work with that, then it's just an obvious thing. It's like you can't just take the same old boring combinations of instruments and use them the same old boring way, right? It's not going to be satisfying to you once you've heard Sgt. Pepper's or whatever, any other 10,000 other pop albums that do interesting things. So that was from the very early works that I made. That was something that was really important, was finding distinctive instrumental combinations and writing for them in ways that would be surprising and hopefully beautiful and engaging. So that's led me into a number of different areas. One of them has been an exploration of rare instruments, which I don't use because they're rare, but I use them because I want a particular type of timbre, and I know that instrument can do it. So I've done that throughout my career so far, and sometimes there's been pretty significant logistical challenges in getting some of these things performed, because if you write for really rare instruments, then you actually have to find them, and then you have to find people willing to play them, and then the instruments might not be in perfect condition, and you might have to have them serviced and all of this kind of thing. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. But on Iridescent Notation, there's a number of pieces like that have really unusual instrumentation.
And I was fascinated to hear that you were incorporating microtonality. Is that something that you feel very strongly about in your work?
Yeah, microtonality has been present in my work for a long time, partly because when I started getting interested in it, I made sure that I could hear the intervals inwardly and that I could sing them, right? So that it wasn't an abstract thing where you just put, a quarter flat notation symbol on a score, but you don't exactly know what it's going to sound like. It was important to me that those intervals be things that I could sing, that I could understand, and that I could hear inwardly. And I spent a lot of time actually working on that when I was in my early 20s, really getting to know these different microtonal intervals. And then they just sort of became part of my hearing, part of my ear. And I really like working with them because they just give you all of these really rich harmonic possibilities. The other thing is, before the development of equal temperament, if you were to play a keyboard piece, in one of the earlier Baroque temperaments, in, let's say, the piece is in F major, and then you modulate to some distant key. When you get to the distant key, because of the way these temperaments were set up, the intervals are going to sound weird. It's going to sound really bizarre and out of tune and all of these sorts of things. And that's part of the quality of the modulation. Not only is it distant from the home key, but it also, the intervals just sound strange when you get to the very keyboard instruments on pianos where every interval sounds the same. All the keys sound the same, it's homogeneous. And so using microtonality is really a way of getting a little bit beyond that homogeneity and getting into the interstices of sound. Because the other thing is, a lot of this is context dependent, but in classical music, when you have a leading tone, you tend to play it, if you're playing on a string instrument, you play it a little bit higher, a little bit sharper, right? You don't play all the intervals exactly the same way. Depends on their position in the chord, depends on where you are in relation to the tonic and so on. But it's not this rigid thing where every note sounds the same. You get that on a piano, but not on a violin. So the microtones are also a part of acknowledging the fact that even though a lot of my work, well, all of my work actually, doesn't use functional tonality, nevertheless, there's a sense of the intervals as being things that can be bent and that can move in a particular direction and that can point upwards, or can point downwards, depending on what direction the harmony is moving in. If you need to, then you can use micro intervals to accentuate those qualities.
Did you find Xenakis's microtonal stuff interesting?
Well, I find Xenakis incredibly interesting, but he didn't affect me with regards to harmony, though, because I don't think Xenakis really heard his music harmonically. I don't know how he heard it exactly, but it doesn't create a harmonic effect, really. It's getting back to what I was saying about Charles Ives earlier. Not every great composer is a great harmonist, or even necessarily thinks much in terms of harmony. And I don't really get that impression with him, so it didn't affect me all that much. Harmony is an incredibly important thing to me, and it's something that I've spent, my entire career up to this point trying to come to grips with, and trying to always go farther and find new paths within. And so I tend to gravitate towards composers, I suppose, that have a very developed harmonic sense, let's say.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't saying that Xenakis was a harmony guy. Clearly, he's a shape, sound mass, timbre organizer, more, and outside of harmony. And those masses often get built on clashes between some quarter tones and microtonal things going on. And I guess I always felt like he was a real friend of the percussion composer too.
Right.
And I remember those two big percussion de Strasbourg pieces. And aren't you doing something with them?
Yes, they asked me actually to do something with them a few years ago, and I haven't done it yet, which is just I've had many projects competing for my attention, and that one, for one reason or another, keeps getting sidetracked. But we do have a long-standing project to do a piece together at some point.
Yeah,
and they're my neighbors, so there's no excuse.
Yeah, I saw them a few years, well, probably 10 years ago. I took my son to see them do the big sextet spatialized in the hall.
Oh, yeah.
So two guys on stage, two guys in the middle, and two guys behind you. And it was absolutely incredible. I mean, when they're laying into those wood blocks and you're 3 feet away from them, it's pretty intense. I'm going to turn a light on here. It's kind of dark. So I know from following your work that you're a big fan of Captain Beefheart, but
yes, indeed.
And I know that you've put extensive thought into how he puts his pieces together. But I thought I'd ask you just a really easy question. As someone that works with words the way that you do, how do you feel about Beefheart's poetry? It's
great. It does exactly what it should do. I think it's wonderful. He had a gift for coming up with extremely vivid images that are hard to forget. Right? They throw a striking image upon the mind's eye, so to speak, and you just can't forget this. Liquid red salt ran over crystals. It's like, how does he come up with that? It's so intense and vivid and strange and dislocated and surreal and surprising. And the lyrics just consist of streams of these, one after the other. I think Beefheart, I think if you look at his poetry closely, it clearly stems from the beats. You know, there's a connection to Ginsberg and things like that, and Kerouac and I don't know who else he would have been reading at that time. I don't know much about his literary interests. He doesn't seem to have spoken that much about it.
Well, you know who was interesting to him that our friend Bill Arkleroad turned me onto. I didn't realize that Beefheart was influenced or inspired by Ken Nordine. Do you know Ken Nordine's work?
No, I don't know.
Well, obviously, not obviously, but you know, another post-beat guy who was a radio announcer, and he did. You may have seen this. He did jazz in colors. So he wrote poetry for 27 different colors, and then they created musical arrangements to play under his poetry readings. Well, I highly recommend that, and you'll see the connection to Don because, you know, it's very abstract, but it connects because of the color thing. And when I teach Beefheart's songs in my songwriting class, we go at the lyrics, but we also look at the paintings. And I think it's super important to realize just how highly visual he is and how color is going to be used a lot.
Yep,
and
that's right.
And textures and this sort of thing. So that even when he's telling a story like, hey, Garland, I dig your tweed coat, which is, you know, a specific scene that he's referencing, but through the eyes of a painter.
There's the line, rainbow baboon gobbled
15 fish eyes with every spoon.
Yeah. With every spoon. And you can, yeah. Those are lines that stay with you, you know. Nobody else comes up with things like that. Yeah, I love those things. Yeah, you're right about the colors. He often refers to colors and textures, and there's a lot of primary colors, red and yellow and blue, that come up in his song lyrics again and again. Trout Mask Replica is full of primary colors.
Orange claw hammer,
yeah, and orange claw hammer, and there's all sorts of things. So yeah, it's always very visual. I think they work best as recitations. I think it's interesting. Some poetry doesn't work very well when it's read out loud. It's really meant for the page. It's meant to be read silently. And other things have to be declaimed. Like they have to be read out loud to get their full effect. And Beefheart's poetry is like that. I don't think it works as well on the printed page.
Really?
But again, you know, yeah, no, I don't think it does. I think it works best when he's reciting it or singing it or whatever. And in that sense, it has something in common with Ginsberg and Charles Olson and other poets like that, or Ferlinghetti also, where the poet's breath, in other words, the you know, is a major determinant in terms of how long the line is, and what the phrasing is, and what the patterning is. So it's not some abstract constellation of meters and feet and so on, and that's not what it is. It's directly related to the breath and to the body, and that's what I get from Beefheart's poetry as well. Right? It's meant to be declaimed. The breath and the patterning of it and the phrasing of it are very physical, very corporeal, and that's when they really come to life. And I think just reading them silently, you know, it's good too, but it's not the same.
I always found fascinating too the way he would read over the time of the band. So, you know, there's those stories of him not putting on the headphones and maybe hearing leakage from the control room, and that's just how he's going to read it. But then Bill also told me a story where he was complaining about hearing the street noise in the studio from the street and wondering if that was being picked up on his microphone. So there's all these kind of levels of caring, not caring. And the fact that he also wasn't really about memorizing his lyrics. So he was often going on stage with a book to, you know, perform the lyrics. And that there was then this what you're talking about too, with this amount of recitation, but what is his rhythmic thing? And could you notate some of those? Did he care how they laid across the top, of the band? That's a whole area I think that has really yet to be fully appreciated. And I think a big missed opportunity in terms of classic rock or rock history, that people don't deal with him as a singer and a poet.
Well, one of the things to bear in mind about that, I would say, is that there isn't only one strategy, right? He had actually a lot of different approaches to that. So there are songs where, take the Buggy Boogie Woogie from Lick My Decals Off. I mean, that meshes pretty obviously with the instruments, right? There's no particular. It's pretty straightforward how the voice part goes along rhythmically with what the instruments are doing. But then you have other things like the title track, where it's a lot more free in terms of the way that the two line up with each other. You have things, She's Too Much for My Mirror on Trout Mask Replica, where it's only vaguely correlated. But Ella Guru is a fairly conventional song, at least by Trout Mask standards, where in terms of how the voice relates to the instruments, and it settles into a groove, right? It's pretty straightforward as far as that goes. So there's a lot of different things, and then you have tracks like what's a good example? Hobo Chang Ba, or where there's a kind of a vocal personality that's very different, right? Where he invents these characters or these accents that are different from song to song. Like the way he sings on that track is totally different from the way he sings on Well or Telephone or whatever. Yeah, so he's always coming up with these personas and these characters, these ways of singing, and the way that the voice part interacts with the instruments is different on different songs. So this story that you always hear, that he could barely hear the band and so on, that might have been true sometimes, but there are tracks on Trout Mask where that just doesn't hold up. There's no way, like, where it's just too synchronized, and it's in a particular key, and he's in tune the whole time, right? Yeah. And I just don't buy it that he couldn't hear what the band was doing, or that it was just randomly synchronized.
Well, this is something that I got into with my interview with Zoot, was, his ear was great. He sang in tune a lot. He knew where things were, and also that he could take on different personae and sing like Frank Sinatra, or sing like Conway Twitty, or he was a true vocalist, and that's fascinating to me too. But I think it comes to a very interesting fruition on the last two albums. So I know a lot of people do focus on the classic stuff, but I think Ice Cream for Crow and Dock at the Radar Station have in many ways his most important vocal performances, where he's going to go down to just solo poetry on 81 Poo Patch. He's going to just have guitar strumming while he's doing Sioux Egypt. They've got the rocker songs in there, but they've got then brickbats and really abstract composition while he's again throwing out these rhythmic images. So I really think that the last two records are really incredible in terms of when he decided to stop, and what he was doing with his voice, and what he was doing with his poetry, and what it's also a different working situation by that point. He's much less gnarly as a band leader in the later two bands, the last two. So
yeah. No, I agree. I really admire the last two records in particular. I think they're brilliant. They're I don't know if they're overlooked exactly, because I would assume that most of the people that would be interested in Trout Mask would take the time to listen to the later ones as well. But actually, I think the first Beefheart record I ever heard was Dock at the Radar Station. That was the first one I was able to find a copy of. And I listened to that one over and over again. I was totally thrilled by it. I'm trying to remember what tracks. Well, Hothead was certainly Yeah, that makes an immediate impression. Just just how characterful it is, how much life that album has, how much energy it has. Also, it's a tremendously energetic album.
You
And then
use
there's
me like an ashtray heart.
yeah, he really gets into the grit of every single word, and he squeezes out every every ounce of expressivity and intensity that he can from it. And he knows what he's doing. Like he's a mature vocalist, and he's got a wide range of things he can do with his voice, and it's great. It's brilliant. Um, Doc, Ice Cream for Crow is a little more muted, I would say. It's a little bit less intense in that respect.
Well, it does have Making Love to a Vampire with a monkey on my knee. Oh no, that's
That's on Doc. That's on Doc.
Skeleton. Yeah, so Skeleton
Yeah.
makes good.
Skeleton makes good. Yeah.
There are so many things,
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah. No, it's great though. It's great. But you can kind of see why that was the last record in a way, because it's a bit of a collage of things that he had been doing. So some of the tracks on that were composed 10 years prior to the recording or more. So it's definitely a mix of things. There was relatively little new material that was actually written for it, and then you have things like the spoken word track that was actually intended for Shiny Beast, or not Shiny Beast, Batching Puller, and ended up on that one.
yeah.
So it's a little bit less cohesive than Doc, and but still it's great. I mean, the best things on that are fantastic. It sounds to me like he's getting a bit tired, and we know that he had physical issues that were starting to appear at that point, which also prompted the move to being a painter.
Yeah, but Sheriff of Hong Kong, I would put that up there with anything.
Oh yeah, it's a great track.
And that's one where you can kind of even hear that he might have been banging that out on the piano.
Yeah. Well, it's all those fifths, It's like you can see where the hands would be going, and yeah.
So what are you working on these days?
Well, these days I just finished a violin concerto that I wrote actually in 2 stages. I did a first version of the piece in 2018, and that was premiered in Switzerland a couple of years ago. And then I completely rewrote it from top to bottom for a larger orchestra. And that was meant to be performed in October in Ukraine, but because of COVID, it's been pushed back until the spring. So that was the big project for the first half of 2020. And right now I'm working on a 30-minute long piece for some friends of mine in Bern, Switzerland, that I've been working with for 10 years. They're great performers, and they asked me to write an octet for them. So I'm working on that. And I'm working on a 3rd book of poems also, although it's not really poems, it's more like prose poetry. And that's actually been in the works for 5 or 6 years now. And I'm only now getting to a point where I kind of vaguely see what I'm doing with it. So, so that's been an interesting process. Because of COVID, this weird thing where a lot of projects have been postponed, and a lot of things have kind of been condensed into a smaller amount of time than would normally be the case, just because there was a long period where either I couldn't work or the concerts couldn't happen or whatever. So I've got actually quite a lot of pieces I have to write at the moment. And so after the Proton piece, the octet is done, then I'm going to be writing a piece for an ensemble in Montreal, and a few other things after that. So lots to do. There's never a dull moment.
I know I tell people, I may not be getting rich doing this, but I'm never bored.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? But what a marvelous life if you're never bored. That's a rare thing.
But
it's a rare and precious thing.
I remember early hating being bored, so it was always a goal.
Well, what being bored means is that there's a big part of you that isn't being used. Right? You're not being stimulated properly, and that's an intolerable thing, right? You feel that this precious, irreplaceable human potential that is uniquely yours is just buried. You know, it's not being born the way it should be. It's not coming into being. I find that to be an intolerable feeling. So that's probably where my workaholism comes in. That's why, you know, that's probably why I do so many things. I feel like I have this precious gift of life and and of breath and the ability to do things. And I have to push that as far as I can. That's my mission on this earth. So I'm in a state of hyperstimulation, you know, and excitement at being able to do these things.
It's the best place to be in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it totally is. And it's a great, great gift. And I'm grateful for it and determined to make the most of it. So.
That's fantastic to hear from you, Samuel. I wonder what analyses videos are we going to see coming up?
Well, I've got a long list of pieces I want to do. I haven't been able to do as many of them recently for a number of reasons, just partly because of the demands on my time and also the disruptions of COVID, actually, which caused a lot of disruption in my schedule. But there's a long list of things. I'm going to do a video on John Cage. I'm going to do one on George Antheil. I'm going to do a Debussy video. I'll probably get around to Elliott Carter.
Which Carter?
I haven't decided. It's a hard choice to make. I'm probably one of the later pieces, actually, because the pieces he was writing in the 60s would take a 30-hour video to explain. So I just don't want to bother doing that.
I'm a big fan. Like, what are your favorite Carter pieces?
The Piano Concerto, the Variations for Orchestra, the Second String Quartet, the Cello Sonata, great work. Catenaries, which is a late piano piece, brilliant piece. Soundings, one of his very latest pieces. I think he was probably about 100 when he wrote that one.
Yeah.
And a long list of pieces. There's many wonderful pieces by Carter.
Night Fantasies.
Yep, that's a great one as well.
Speaking of Mr. Cage, I sat next to Mr. Cage for the premiere of the Carter Triple Duo.
Oh, really? I wonder what he made of it.
He was cool with everything, you know. Carter made fun of Ligeti though in the same evening, so that was a fun night for me. It was like, there's Cage, he's cool with whatever, and then I see Mr. Carter, and I said, Mr. Carter, it's so great to see you. Really happy to be here for the premiere. What did you think of the Ligeti? Because I think it was the Ligeti Chamber Concerto was on the same program.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Oh, that's simple-minded claptrap."
It's so funny. Composers are the worst, you know. They're so
They are the worst.
They're just the worst. Yeah, awful people. You know what's funny is Carter and Feldman famously disliked each other. Although there is actually a video on YouTube of them having a conversation. It's actually quite funny. But I think there is an idea that Carter represented this genteel, uptown, Ivy League, intellectual, well-to-do, kind of thing.
That's all true.
And Feldman, which is true, and Feldman, this sort of more sort of working class, but which actually is a bit of a simplification, because Feldman's family were actually very successful and had a very successful textile business.
Oh yeah.
So he was actually not working class.
No, but it's much more interested in a thing like a representational kind of thing of the textile patterns than whatever Carter was into. I mean, who even knows what Carter? I mean, I've heard it's urban. I've heard he's interested in jazz, but I mean, I could much more see Feldman reaching an audience at that time than Carter. And a lot of times, with that simple-minded claptrap rip was just perfectly telling. You know what I mean? Like, I require a certain amount of, undigestible, just swarm. And I will not have periodicity. I will not contend with any kind of repetition. We're going constant renewal, baby.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah. Some
Right?
of those aspects of his style are things that I have trouble with. There are pieces that I find very difficult to enjoy. And part of it, there's a, since we're talking about catty remarks from composers, Messiaen actually said about Carter that he's good, but his problem is that his ear just isn't quite good enough. And that's a really interesting remark with regards to Carter, because it's actually kind of true. Um, Carter was forever coming up with these systems, pitch class systems for how do you organize
Rhythmic
your
system.
and rhythmic systems. Yeah, but it's very formalized and systematized in many respects. And he was, he had this this approach to harmony that was based on intervals and pitch classes, but that was it was weirdly dry and detached in many respects. And I don't think he was sensitive to the affective qualities of intervals, or I wonder sometimes how much he actually heard these things, and to what extent they were more calculated or derived from some kind of a process. And you can hear that in some of his stuff, where it's you can hear the mechanical pencil tracing its way across the page more than you can actually hear the sounds springing from some kind of inner voice or inner hearing.
I feel the same way about Babbitt. And so, if you get comfortable with that, I'm fine with it. I don't think music making has to come from one place. And I certainly think that some people have a lot of creative ideas for putting together systems. I love systems, I don't know that I can hear Mr. Carter's systems. I don't know that he did, but I know that he put them in there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, he wrote many, many wonderful pieces. So I don't like all of them, but the best ones are phenomenal.
Yeah.
So there you go. Yeah.
So, we're both really interested in kind of the wilder aspects of things, and I want to, tell you I appreciate that about where you're coming from. Certainly, boundaries aren't a particular interest unless we set them, and that's a good place to be, I think, creatively, man. So I really appreciate you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate the conversation very much, and the invitation. And it's a real pleasure talking to you. And we'll have to do it again.
I think we shall. So
Yeah.
so I thank everybody for listening to all this inside baseball here, and hopefully it was entertaining, if not maybe a little bit enlightening. Thank you to everybody for supporting what we're doing here at the podcast, and thank you to my guest, Samuel Andreyev. Looking forward to more stuff from you for sure.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.